So welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us on the second and final day of the ND Global Adaptation Index. We have a great program to enjoy together today. And over the next 4 hours, we'll be hearing from Ambassador Pickering when he arrives, and also having the awards ceremony and release of the 2013 ND Gain Index. A highly awaited and a very exciting opportunity to share with you some new analysis about this important tool. There is a slight change in the program this morning in that Ken Hirsch, the president of NGP Energy Capital Management, will be kicking us off as we await the arrival of the ambassador. And many of you know that Ken is the co-founder and the chief executive officer of NGP Energy Capital Management. He is also a deep advisor and director to numerous public and private companies, and currently serves on the Dean's Council of the Harvard Kennedy School and on the advisory councils of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University and the Benheim Center for Finance at Princeton University. Ken is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the World Economic Forum, roles that really help to inform his thinking about the importance of adaptation. I think it is very important to acknowledge that in 2010, Ken founded the Global Adaptation Institute, which has become the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. And after chairing GAIN's advisory council, he now serves as a member of the board of ND GAIN. Ken, we are very, very deeply grateful for all of your mentorship and leadership, your creative and pragmatic approach, and the very impactful efforts that you've made to unlock global adaptation solutions in both the corporate and the development community that will help to improve all of our lives around the globe, using metrics and drawing attention to the important role that adaptation needs to play in all of our futures. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Joyce. Sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday. My schedule didn't permit it, but it sounds like it was a fantastic day. I wanted, with this session, to highlight a couple things and give some background, and then also what I see as sort of the call to action on this important topic. The conclusion that we're going to hear about from the data for the year is that we now have 100 years of runway needed to move the needle in certain countries. Unfortunately, we don't have 100 years. I know I don't have 100 years. And it's something that I believe that message in and of itself is a call to action. The most important thing around ND GAIN and the index is creating a common language. The problems that we saw in the fact that the Earth is changing, and the way that humanity was sort of going about this in sort of isolated pockets of activity, primarily around the energy complex, in our opinion, in our observation, were isolated, and were not going to have the impact that they needed in the time required. And so when the world was focusing on Copenhagen and deciding what the next leapfrog movement in energy was going to be, it was apparent to me as an energy investor that dislodging the 100-year installed base and trillions of dollars of capital that had gone into the energy infrastructure and system, it was too much to displace in a matter of years. It would take decades or even generations. And so in my view was at that moment that the world is going to wake up at some point and realize that the turn back the clock strategy may not be the right strategy for this generation. Most generations say we're going to do it better than our predecessors. And I believe that going forward requires people to say the planet is changing. Get over it. Okay? The planet has always changed. Now, maybe have human beings accelerated the change in the planet? Maybe, maybe not. But while we're debating it, things are happening. And the world is going to shift its attention and say we're wasting time and we're not gaining momentum. And so the adaptation message was being lost. So creating a body of thought around adaptation was really our goal. And I want to compliment Dr. Juan Jose Dabub, who really took my vision and made it a reality in the last couple of years. And then the entire team at Notre Dame is taking it to the next level. And it's a pleasure for me to see that happen. The topic itself clearly is important. It's one that everybody in this room is self-selected to be in this room, so we all know that it's important. But it's also very timely. There were two things recently. One is the cover of Business Week that came out, Bloomberg Business Week that came out a week ago, has the entire country of Kiribati about to go underwater, and people are debating whose fault it is. Is it, and who should pay for it? Should it be the developed countries who did this to us, or it should be the people who are being most impacted? And when these stories begin to show up and put human faces on issues around global changes, and in this case, it might be about rising sea levels and South Pacific island nations where hundreds of thousands of people live on a 2-mile strip of land that they now have tent cities on the runway, which happens to be the highest point on the island, okay, and they have to move off when an airplane comes in. I mean, this is what's happening now. And the people at the bottom of the pyramid obviously are the ones that are impacted the most earliest, okay? The most resilient are obviously the richer countries. But it's not just about rich versus poor. It's also a time period where even the rich countries themselves are in a quandary. And Todd Stern was quoted after the Warsaw meeting recently, where he said, he called it the hard reality that no step change in overall level of public funding from developed countries is going to come anytime soon. The fiscal reality of the U.S. and other developed countries is not going to allow it. So now we're at a point post-global financial crisis where even the developed countries may find it hard to mobilize the dollars needed. So where we sit today is an intersection. Public funds will not cover adaptation to the extent needed, okay? So that leaves the private sector. The public sector can provide the commitment and the frameworks to mobilize and to create, to enable the private sector to come in where they're wanted, where they're needed, and where they can make a return. And that intersection, I think, is where ND Gain comes together, and creating the two axes of the index. We can all see vulnerability. It's on the cover of a magazine now. This is vulnerability, okay? But adding the component of readiness was really, in my opinion, the concept of doability. How do we add doability? Because these are heart-wrenching stories, gut-wrenching stories. I wish we could helicopter more money onto these places and fix the problem. But if a country isn't ready, if they don't have, whether it be the infrastructure or the social acceptance or the institutional acceptance or the maturity of civil society to receive aid, then you're really just wasting money. You're throwing money down a rat hole, and we'd rather find a better place that has a higher and better use for it. So bringing those two concepts together, where countries might be highly vulnerable and very small changes to their policy can improve readiness and make a dramatic move in their ability to adapt. And it has nothing to do with money. It has simply to do with a stroke of a pen. And so adding readiness and vulnerability onto the same index creates that common language. So in my opinion, it's a hopeful message. It's not 100 years, we're never going to see it message. But it's a message that says if we have something that's important that we know about, that is eminently doable, to relocate 100,000 people from the South Pacific is doable. We relocated 3 times that in a weekend when Katrina hit New Orleans. And they all spread around Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas and other places. That can be done. It's not a question of money. The world is wealthy enough collectively. It's just a question of finding those galvanizing, energizing moments that are ahead of the crises. If 100,000 people are all of a sudden on life rafts, believe me, people will come to their aid. But at that point, it's too late, because the problem clearly adds a few more zeros than 100,000 people when we know how much global infrastructure and global populations are within 5 to 10 miles of coastlines. And that's just rising sea levels. If sea levels weren't rising, we'd be talking about other issues. Okay, so it's really, the adaptation language isn't just about climate. We're talking about 2 to 3 billion more bodies being added to the world, population going from 7 to 10. We're talking about 2 billion more people joining the ranks of middle class and enjoying middle class consumption habits, and what that does to the world's resource draw. And then the massive movement of urbanization, and you overlay climate to those global forces, and that's where the needs for adaptation come together. So it's a timely story, it's a humanitarian story, it is the ultimate sustainability story. And that is, when we were talking to institutions about what to do with the Global Adaptation Institute, we had a couple choices. We could think about it in terms of a narrow, very narrow, self-serving, let's create a black box of data and let's try to go get people to use our data. And what we found was that taking the transparency element to its extreme was quite important. There are organizations that have black box data, and that mentality is wonderful and can serve purposes very well. But to create the sense of urgency that we saw, we needed to open it up, and we needed to find an institutional platform that allowed this to spread in the ways that it could possibly spread, that hopefully are beyond mine or Juan Jose's even wild imagination. And we quickly settled on finding a world-class university with a world-class research-based faculty, with a nascent climate, didn't have their stake in the ground to where if they were already, trying to develop the next renewable energy of all time, that all of a sudden the adaptation theme might somehow be seen in conflict. The world has enough conflict in it. We don't need internal conflict. And as far as I know, the university conflict there's obviously conflict over money, but the most important conflict is over parking that I've seen at most universities. But I didn't want to add to the conflict at a university. And Notre Dame and the the climate change initiatives was really developing. And so having ND Gain join that and become part of that at the outset, and really being a tool to help catapult that and catapult the institutional work on sustainability has been a real pleasure for me to be a part of. So I think that it's a great marriage, but with a private sector. What started as private sector philanthropy has now become a model for intersecting the intellectual framework and the intellectual platform of a great university that has a global footprint, the private sector needs, and also how to involve the public sector in a transparent, open way. So it's been fantastic for me to be a part of. And I think that as we look to the future, I think that the model itself is transportable. And we had a wonderful session before this session with our advisory board talking about ways where the index can go to the next level and actually be a call to action and actually be telegraphing what action works and what action works faster and moves people in the right direction on the index. So that to me is just very gratifying. And it's a gratifying way to make an impact. It's a gratifying way to provide a framework that really could bend the line. And we hope to come back next year and the year after and look at the data and say it went from 100 years to 80 years in 1 year. And if we can do that, then the next year we can go from 80 years to 50 years in 2 years. And those are the kinds of things that we now have the tools to use. And the world just needs tools. There are too many well-meaning people at both the public and private sectors who are working on so many different levels on this exact topic that they just need something to coalesce around. So that's really been my goal, and it's taken on a life beyond what I could have even imagined. So thank you, Juan Jose, for your great leadership, and Joyce, thank you for your leadership as we embark into the future. So with that, thank you all for being here, and it's just a pleasure for me to be a part. So thank you. Sure. We have time for some questions, if there are questions.
How do you see specifically the opportunity for the private sector to utilize the index and the work of ND Gain? Well,
I think the most important thing for the private sector is always looking for markets and looking for opportunities to invest. Really pretty simple. When the private sector moves but the private sector does have limited time and limited money. So the private sector has to prioritize. So if you're a consumer products company and you see a lot of people in an area and you have a product that can be produced in that region, and you can choose to site your plant in country A or country B, and you have to make a choice. You can send your research team, you can call everybody you know, and you say, tell me about country A and country B, and how do we make this decision? Because we're going to put substantial capital, and we want that capital to live for 30 years and produce and become our whole distribution and supply chain, et cetera, for that region. How about if you could log on to ND Gain and say, we picked country A over country B because in the last 6 years, this is the country A trend, and they're moving in the right direction, and country B is backsliding. Well, then the leadership of country B says, wait a minute, what's wrong with us? And the company says, this is real simple. Look, you've done these 3 things less well than these guys, or you've ignored 4, 5, and 6. Then it becomes a common language. Much like the analogy I use is the rating agencies. The rating agencies in the bond world have become a common language. You may not know the difference between this industry and that industry, but if you're a bond investor and S&P says, oh, that's a AAA, or that's a AA credit, and that's a AA credit. And this credit is in an XYZ manufacturing business, and this is companies in an ABC service business. But they say, oh, it's a AA. S&P gives it a AA, that's where AA's trade, and I can invest, I like to buy AA bonds. I think that's a good yield for my risk reward. And they've taken all the disparate information and created a common language. So to me, the index can become the private sector's language, and then the public sector uses it, or conversely, the public sector uses it to entice the private sector. Imagine the politician, the political leader of either a city or a state or a federal body who goes around and says, listen, in the last 3 years, we've moved from here to here on the gain index. We are much more ready. You can, if you have employees in our country, you know they can raise families. You know we have good public health. We know we have sustainable goals in mind. We have the ability to look and think 30, 40, 50 years ahead. And that, to me, is about adaptation, and especially countries that are more vulnerable. If you're an island country now, which is, I don't want this to be thought of as just a rising sea level island. That just happens to be the visual that's easy for us to grasp. But there are hundreds of millions of people in island chains in the South Pacific. And imagine if somebody says, why would I site a manufacturing facility in your country? And I want a 30 or 40 year view that this capital is going to be safe, that I'm going to earn a return on this capital over that time period. And so the things I'm going to ask, tell me about your political system, tell me about your public health, tell me about your education, because my employees need to have be able to raise families, tell me about your infrastructure, tell me about your sustainability. And those are the kinds of questions that come into play when a private sector is making a short-term capital decision that they need a long-term return on. And so really I think those are the two vital uses. One's a demand pull and one's a supply push, and I think they both work. I think it can become a political tool as well. I would envision the day that a candidate says, under my opponent's watch, we've backslid on the ND gain index. This is bad for us, okay? Or the incumbent saying, under my watch, we've gone forward. This is a good thing. Those are the kinds of things where people today would say, we've improved our fiscal position and we've gone from a single A to a double A under my watch. That would be a finance minister would absolutely get up and use that. So what are they implicitly doing? They're implicitly using an index, a common language, and something that they can easily measure. And I think we have all those components. Any other questions? Peter.
Ken, we can think about this from a country standpoint, but we can also think about it from a sector standpoint. When you look at those sectors out there, what are the ones that you think are going to be the most important to concentrate on?
sectors from a public or private?
Like the water sector, the
Right.
food sector,
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, the three biggies are water, food, and energy, and infrastructure. Infrastructure. That'd probably be a fourth. Would be infrastructure, urban planning are really big right now. I think that the massive urbanization that's happening in the developing world is overrunning the infrastructure that was planned, and how do you avoid the cycles of underbuilt cities attracting massive populations, developments of slums, the slum getting bad enough to where something happens to, other than a real estate developer bulldozing it, something happens to say we need to now incorporate that, and you're always playing catch up. And so I think that cycle, but quickly when you're on that conversation, you quickly go to water, you quickly go to food, and you quickly go to energy. So I think they're really all in one. Now that is a very developing world perspective. I think in the developed world, I think the adaptation is a food and water issue more than the urban planning, urbanization. I think the infrastructure game is well enough known and defined in the developed world. But when people realize that supply chains matter, that food systems matter, where people get their food, and how that food is transported, and where that food is grown, and a food shortage in one part of the world, or a change in climate in one part of the world can impact their part of the world, I think that's when these things are going to matter. If we can use this as a predictive tool, then we win. I mean, that's really when the rating agencies are trying to predict the quality of being able to pay off a bond 30 years from now, and they're using a tool today to give it a rating. I mean, that's really the ultimate victory, to say not that this isn't a backward looking, but these are the indicators to say, does this company, does this country, does this city, does this region have their act together? And if the answer is yes, then good things happen. If the answer is no, bad things happen. And if the climate were to change, that's when populations migrate, and that's when machetes come out, and that's no good. So we got to make sure that we're ahead of the game, and that's really the focus on adaptation. Other questions?
So Ken, when we've spoken with users about ND gain, one of the words that often comes to their mind is, well, we're about margins. And so this is, when we think about working in the emerging world, we don't want it to be about philanthropy. We want it to be about our return on investment. And I think, obviously, you've gave a really good case here for why gain is helpful on the return on investment. But can you describe a little bit more, as a leader of a business yourself, how you make those distinctions between what is philanthropic or around development versus those hard-edged business decisions, which we're hoping ND gain will really inform?
Well, I think that there's a clear distinction in the private sector between what is philanthropic and what is a real specific return on investment, because you're not expecting your dollars on a philanthropic investment to be measurable, that it comes back to your bottom line. I would say that, especially for the larger corporations, that line is blurring, and in the energy business, which I know is the one I know as well enough, that if you are an international oil and gas company, or an oil and gas company that does business in another country, you can expect to be asked that if you're going to operate in a region, you can expect to be asked to make sure you rebuild all the roads, that you build some hospitals, that you build some schools, and you build some housing. Okay? Put it into your operating costs, put it into your budget. It has nothing to do with drilling the well and putting in the pipeline and getting your product to market. It has nothing to do with that. You can expect that that's going to be asked. If you don't do it, and if it's not asked, and you don't do it, then people will take your stuff and they'll do it themselves. And so you've seen countries become sort of lawless around the energy business, because people look around and said, those are our assets, they're pulling out of the ground. How can these people be getting rich They have no concept of the operating costs or the investment that went in, but they'll say, how can these people get rich selling our oil when we're here with no school and no road and no clothes? So that's when many little terrorist things start happening, and those countries tend to have to, it has to become very, very forceful to stop that. So I think that the international oil and gas community has really recognized now that even if you're not asked, it's better to just be proactive and say, we're going to do this. And so the companies that I'm familiar with are doing a very good job. And they're doing it at the local level. They're very disgruntled. They tried the top-down approach, and that $1 top-down ends up a dime to the local village. And so they would rather go in and say, okay, we're producing in this village. We're going to make sure that we build the roads, build the school, build the hospital, and build the social infrastructure. Have some leaders that we work with, community outreach people that we work with, and really, it's self-serving for them because they then have a safe place to operate, and their employees have a safe place to live. That's a very valuable thing. The old model was to get the concession from the federal government and put in the capital investment, and as long as you kept them safe, you were fine. And then you just did what you want at the local level. And that was not sustainable. And so now, even you'll see, it's amazing how many oil and gas companies you see operate in really treacherously awful governed countries. And yet they seem to operate there okay. And why do they operate there okay? It's because you can have a country that on its face, the way we in Washington might say, oh, this is an unstable, it's relatively lawless, et cetera, but there are places where it's quite lawful. And companies are able to navigate the system and work at the local levels and the regional level and do it just right. And I think that's an interesting kind of model because it's not just philanthropic. They're getting a return on it. It's just all balled up in one. It's a good question.
Ken, it's fascinating to hear you talk about adaptation in the broader context of population growth, upward mobility, urban migration, and climate change. And when you look at it in that context, almost everything that the private sector does add value as core business outcome, not as corporate philanthropy, but as core business outcome and services provided, adds value to adaptation when you think of adaptation beyond sea level rise. And so it's not just food, energy, and water. You think of public health in the context of preventive infection prevention, or in the context of health care, which is cure.
Right.
And once you bundle all of those together, practically every business can see a lot of commercial value in launching into this area and actually capturing it. And the question I have is, for companies to be able to make a stronger business case, one of the things that needs to happen is putting dollars and cents in front of natural capital, ecosystem services, and other aspects that won't that make this adaptation business case a lot stronger for the private sector? And what kind of time horizon do you see this happening, where companies start internalizing and monetizing all these externalities so that the business case for their adaptation outcomes becomes even stronger?
I didn't follow the question. Do people put money into the venture side?
The fact that companies do not look at return on investment just in the context of very narrow outcomes, what their customers are paying for it, and go beyond that to how they're helping boost natural capital, accounting for natural capital, accounting for ecosystem services, so that there's the societal benefits and environmental benefits that they're enjoying indirectly get accounted for, so that they will start tracking the outcomes in that context.
I think that's happening. I mean, could they do more of it faster, sooner? Absolutely. But my observation is that the multinational companies are doing a lot of that now. You're starting to see companies report. I mean, there's been some pushback in certain industries, but you're seeing companies report their carbon footprint. You're seeing companies, or at least cognizant of their carbon footprint. They're cognizant of their water footprint, and when they go into a country, what is their what might be their impact on local water supply. So Coca-Cola is very aggressive. Pepsi is very aggressive Anheuser-Busch Bud, InBev is very aggressive in thinking about making sure that they do things right, because they know they want to be there for 20 and 30 and 40 years, 50 years, whatever. In that time frame, they can't do it. So I think it's changing. Would people go in and do something that would be strictly venture-oriented today that might pay off for an ancillary side business? I think some people are doing that. I think the insurance companies are thinking a lot about that, because that's survival for them. So if they can really find ways to mitigate their long-term risk, especially the catastrophic reinsurers, that's a big time business case. And so you're seeing the insurance companies be all around this adaptation, because it's a new paradigm. You can't take your 50-year actuarial model and apply it to the next 50 years if you're talking about different weather events or different climatic events or population movements and things like that. So I think I'm pretty hopeful that companies are doing it, but it's one at a time, and not every country approaches it in the same way, because one person might have much more of a water problem, another person might have more of a sea level problem, another person might have more of an infrastructure or food problem, and so it's not as universal as I think it could be. There was another question in the back.
I really am fascinated by your comment about the oil companies, especially the petrol companies, going in country and building kind of a resilient infrastructure where they're operating. I kind of have two questions. What's the ND gain index of that country and that region, and how does that impact the usefulness of the ND gain index for making a decision if the entity could go in and create their own resilient infrastructure?
Right, and I think that those are the kinds of questions that as we take the ND gain index from the country level and bring it down to the regional or city level, you can really make an impact. What I failed to say is there are plenty of places that the oil and gas industry would like to do that, and they are not welcome to do that. So you think about there's a presumption that whether it be local political leaders, local religious leaders, local tribal leaders, local militia leaders, you name it, whoever happens to have the control of that region, there has to be some level of civility, some level of buy-in that this is a good thing. And if it's really just a head fake that we're going to invite Chevron into our country, into our area, our region, our sub-region, and they put infrastructure here, they develop some assets, and then we take it from them, that's not going to be very sustainable, and that's not going to last very long. So there has to be some institutional buy-in. And I think part of our readiness index is our various proxies for this institutional buy-in. It doesn't have to be democratically elected, bicameral system. It doesn't have to be all that. I mean, there are other ways that work. We didn't corner the market in this country on a representative democracy, and there are other political systems that can work. So I think that those are the elements. So I think that when it happens, it's happening naturally when the force of commerce is great enough. And so there are places where we know there's oil and gas and there's enough of it to tolerate the risk that we might get some of it taxed away or taken or stolen or whatever. But there's thousands of other areas where it's less obvious, where where the private sector needs to take a risk. And you might need to explore in the oil and gas business. It might need to open up a branch office before it opens up a major facility and more of a representative office. And those are the kinds of things that the private sector won't do until there's a certain level of institutional buy-in, i.e. readiness.
Okay, Ken, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Are we?
Yes, we're done, so thank you so much.
Are we ready? Okay, great. Thank you.
Ken, thank you so much, and we're grateful for your time. We have the ambassador joining us. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pickering. I just want to take a quick process check, however, because we also have members of the media here. And so I think that, Ambassador, if you'd like to give brief remarks in advance of the media, that sounds great. And we'll perhaps take 15 minutes or so to hear more about your thoughts. Ken, would you like to introduce the ambassador? Sorry, left without your notes.
How are you?
Ken, terrific. I apologize.
That's
I'm waiting
okay.
for cabs.
Okay.
We got mixed up in this building.
So, I was your stand-in filler.
You did a great job.
No,
heard it.
a weak second choice. It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Pickering. I've had the honor to know Ambassador Pickering for the last few years and become close with him, talking about many of the world's problems. And what I've come to realize is that there are people who talk about history and people who study history, and then there are people who live it. And Ambassador Pickering, the experience the experience that Ambassador Pickering has had in the last 40 years, under all administrations, under so many different regimes, being the ambassador to the United Nations as well as dozen other countries, has been staggering. I could stand up here and introduce him for the next 30 minutes and wouldn't even come close to describing the perspective that he has globally. He is a national treasure, and his experience is one that if you ever get a chance to listen to him, drop what you're doing and listen with both ears. Every time I talk to him, whether it's for 5 minutes or 3 or 4 hours, I come away energized and awed by the perspective that he has. The adaptation topic that we're covering is global, and it intersects politics. It intersects. It transcends country borders, and there is nothing more important than understanding how people and countries and policies all intersect. And Ambassador Pickering has one of the few most longitudinally tested and perspectives. And so it's an honor for me to introduce and to welcome Ambassador Pickering.
Thank you, Ken, very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I deeply apologize to all those who are counting on my being here on time. I started out 45 minutes ago trying to find a cab at Washington and then trying to find you all in the building. You'll know some of what that is because you also had to repeat the process of getting here. But I'm pleased and delighted to be here, and I'd like to talk, Ken, 15 minutes or so, then we'll open it up for questions and be happy to have the press stay as long as I'd like to stay or go away as soon as I'd like. I want to talk about two things in the global perspective that Ken set forward for you. I want to talk about some of the major changes that are taking place, some obvious and maybe some not so obvious, that affect how and what way a country like the United States conducts its foreign and security relations. And then I'd like to talk about some of the major challenges that we have out there, perhaps in a slightly different construct than you've been used to. And I'll explain that as I go along. I think that change and technology in many ways are totally interchangeable in this world. And technology is having one of the most, I think, significant changes. Certainly we look at the world of electronics, and it is not just the Snowden perspective that I think wakes us up on this, but we also look at the field that Ken knows as well as anybody in this room. And Ken, I'd be remiss for not thanking you for that wonderful introduction. I always say a little hyperbole goes a long way, and certainly you helped me stretch that. But I think that the recovery of hydrocarbons from shale is one of those things that technology brings us, and some independence. But technology in the information age is certainly the ability of everybody to be in touch with almost everybody else about almost everything else as the world proceeds. And this has changed a lot. I think it's changed Arab Spring or the Arab transformation. I think it has changed the ability of countries to conduct diplomacy on multiple levels, both with their traditional partners, but also with their non-traditional partners, the non-governmental organizations, the enterprises, the academic world. And so the whole field has opened up, and influences are in many ways now much more closer to hand, much more significant, and I think much more listened to in many parts of the world. What this has done, of course, is helped to change the nature of how we conduct our business as a country. One of the things that I think is interesting in the shifting world is a sense that we're engaged perhaps in a new era of the potential for diplomacy. Certainly what's happened in Iran, the work in Syria, the Secretary of State's efforts to try to find a new way to bring Israelis and Palestinians together in just that area of the world are significant. But the new shift in our look in Asia and the focus perhaps on a number of those questions, whether it is the neuralgic issues of China's increasing efforts to try to use air defense identification zones to control some of the traffic, or the sense that we have of an enormous potential for working with China in the area of climate change and the environment are also important. It's made a real shift in the international world in one or two ways that I think were hard and very difficult lessons for us to learn. That the military is not the sovereign solution for diplomatic problems. And in some cases, as we engage the military, we have found in effect that the disengagement requires a great deal more diplomacy, whether it is in a sense looking at the post-combat period and how and in what way we relate to countries, or whether in fact it is the process that we are now going through with President Karzai of finding a way to set in place an agreement that has the best interests of both countries at heart for the longer term in Afghanistan, and that's significant. We're seeing new shifts in the way the world focuses its attention. Certainly economics over the last dozen years has become as much of a center pivot of international activities and action as the traditional role of political diplomacy and indeed national security. And of course the truth is they're intimately linked and intertwined. They all have much to do with each other. We can't see them necessarily as separate entities totally dealt with by separate people in separate rooms on separate bases. Much of this is, I think, self-evident. And indeed, the major crisis in 2008 and 2009, one we're still working our way through, if I can say that gently and diplomatically, is and has been a major question for us as we look down the road. But so too are other issues, certainly non-traditional issues. I'll mention a number of these as I mention challenges, but one of those is certainly the interrelationship between energy, the environment, and climate change. Whether climate change is a subset of environmental concerns or not, it has its own, and I think peculiar, and certainly in many ways significant dimensions. And if I had told you 10 years ago the Pentagon would within 5 years be focused on the interrelationship between climate change and our national security, you probably would have laughed me out of the room if you'd been impolite, and certainly you would have been highly skeptical about that kind of interrelationship. And so change, and that kind of change, is, I think, a very significant one. Let me mention just one or two other things that stick in my head that I think are important to have out on the table before you. One of those is that we no longer have what I would call the strategic ignorance that comes with looking at each of these narrow issues in its own stovepipe. Something I just said about economics applies in a broader construct as we look at a number of questions. And so the challenges that I have selected to talk to you about are really baskets of issues, issues that have great interrelationships. And it is important, I think, strategically, as we look down the road at these particular questions, that we do so in a basket for several reasons. One is, of course, unanticipated consequences. And energy, the environment, and climate change are in many ways particularly pertinent epitomes of that kind of a look. Certainly any change in energy policy within reason is going to have an impact on the environment and probably on climate change. And indeed, how we address questions of climate change and the environment are going to impact how we make energy policy choices as we go down the road. Simple, very straightforward, very realistic. But in many other sets of issues, we have those. And I'm going to talk about baskets of issues in which there is what I would call a first partner relationship. Many other things are interrelated, and certainly we can, if we do too much interrelationship, become totally confused about priorities and about how to move on questions. The second reason, a smaller but not unimportant one, to look at issues and their interrelationships is that when diplomats and political leaders come to resolve problems, there is often an opportunity to deal with a particular set of questions by finding a resolution in a broader context. So that in fact, resolutions to climate change clearly have to involve energy policy considerations as we go ahead. Sometimes being able to put on the table, if you like, a set of other important advantages in a bilateral or multilateral negotiation makes a difference. And I think that those are important to keep in mind. Finally, even though we need to think strategically about these issues, certainly the answers will begin to come as we look at them in their individual stovepipes. And so that is a process that has to kind of bounce back and forth if we are, in a matter of our own national strategy and our own national interest, going to look at these. Now, what are the problems that I consider to be the big challenges for us? I'll run over these fairly quickly. Each of them has great opportunities, in my view, for change, but let me just run those down. I think there are 7 that are out ahead of us. The first is, of course, the continued financial crisis, not necessarily in terms of priority, but first on my list because I find it easy to remember it that way. And this was a set of issues in terms of stovepipes that began with home mortgages and ended up with macroeconomic policy management and went through banking and finance and almost all areas of national economic interest. A second set of questions, perhaps more geographical in a traditional sense, is what I call rivals and partners. How we deal with China, with Russia, with India, with the European Union, with Japan, with Brazil, and perhaps several other large continental states. It requires, in my view, a new definition of interrelationships. In many cases, we need to find win-win answers as opposed necessarily to zero-sum. And win-win, in effect, helps you to deal with the continued nagging negatives that are almost absolutely endemic to these sets of relationships. We have them with the European Union, we have them with Japan, and certainly have them with China and Russia, and we have them with India. But it's important, I think, to have an overlay of positive interest within which to contain the question of how to deal with what I call the ankle-kicking prospect of negatives. Anybody ever played soccer, they know what ankle kicking is all about. I think a third set of issues, also geographic, is a huge preoccupation for us. The Middle East, from the Straits of Hercules to the Hindu Kush. Certainly what is happening in the Arab world, the transformation. How to deal with peace in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine. The future of Iraq, which is something that has tended to diminish in our consciousness, but is in no real sense a settled problem. How and in what way Iran either may go forward or backward, not only in nuclear areas, but in the non-nuclear areas that may come out of some success in the nuclear areas, and then to stretch it further east, Pakistan and Iran. In Afghanistan. And there's no question at all in my mind that Pakistan remains one of the most important challenges across that stretch of the globe as we look at a country with nuclear weapons, a country with a declining educational system, with severe economic problems, with governance problems, with the growth of fundamentalism, with troubles with a number of its neighbors. We need to be thinking much more carefully about that. The next set of issues I would call weapons of mass destruction and their interrelationships. And that's nuclear and chemical and biological. That's arms control and disarmament. That's issues of whether we can build down and still be safe with a smaller posture in these areas because of the potential for accident and miscalculation. It's the challenge of whether, in fact, we can convince others that they don't need these particular weapons for their national security. And it's the big challenge that the four horsemen of the Cold War, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, put up on the blackboard for us 4 years ago. Could we actually find a world with zero nuclear weapons? Is it possible? Can we defend ourselves under those circumstances? It's an interesting challenge. At first, it looks ridiculous, but you begin to think about it, and you think that there is some prospect. And these four Cold Warriors are not stupid, and they haven't, in fact, been born yesterday. Another set of questions that takes us in a more ramified way in today's world is what I would call poverty, growth, and development. And certainly questions like food, health, and water fall perhaps into the answer column. But the effects column is very ramified. Not total effect, but at least contributing effect is in failed and failing states, criminal activities internationally, narcotics trafficking, the impact on trade, immigration and migration. We can see a lot of these. And a great deal of the world's second-order crises and problems, which have a potential to bloom into first-order issues, comes out of this nexus and our long struggle to find answers. And sitting here in this building with USAID as a major tenet here, one can only hope but be impressed that we need to find new ways, perhaps multilateral ways, to do a lot better job in this area. And then I would say, not last nor least, but the question of energy, environment, and climate change, which I know you are focused on, but which I would like to say is a struggle now between what we can afford in the short term and what we can endure in the long term. And that's a very difficult trade-off. It's not one that recommends itself easily. Every generation would like to kite their checks to their grandchildren as long as they don't think about it in moral terms. And we're a little bit in that nexus of problems now. And I think it is time, obviously, for us to think about it. We're getting closer to international agreement, but we remain some distance. And so let me end by saying the other set of problems that I'm looking at are how we organize ourselves as a national government to deal with them. We have, certainly, the last major change was in 1947. Do we need to take another look at how we address the world? We've done a few things since then. The big challenge is, can we make our government work together? I would suppose in this city, the frank statement is, can we make our government work? But work together is a broader and more interesting proposition, and we're challenged about how to do that. And the final question is the international institutions, which have practically exhausted the alphabet's capacity to name them. Are they in many ways now capable of being syncopated, coordinated, brought together, funded, made more useful, filling the gaps that we have seen? And all of those are parts of the problem, but each of them, in my view, also has an answer. And in many ways, if I were giving you the half-hour or the 45-minute version of the speech, we'd talk about answers, but I'm going to leave that for your questions. So thank you for the chance to give you these few remarks, and I look forward to what you have on your mind. And I'm pleased and privileged to be here, and again, my apologies for, in fact, getting so far behind the clock. Thank you again. Three questions. Why don't you pick the questioners?
Okay.
And I won't be suspected of knowing them all and dealing with only the easy ones.
All right, great. So Peter gets the first one.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Let's. I'll take your lead, and can you tease out a few answers for us?
Sure. I think that we need to think in Syria about whether, despite the fact that there is very little faith yet in that, we can segue from a political settlement on taking away Assad's chemical weapons to a political process that can get us away from having killed 125,000 people 6,000 a month, destabilized the region, opened the door to the radicals, and indeed left many deeply concerned because, in fact, if you look at it, probably Russia and the US are going to have to carry the heavy share of the burden. And increasingly, I find Russia, where I spent a little bit of my life, concerned by the destabilization. So there is, put it this way, the scintilla of a hint of an opportunity, not much more. But we need to work on that rather than, in fact, become convinced, as I think we have now lost the conviction, that in 120 days, one side or the other will win. That's just one example.
Amy, in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to try to sneak in two questions. If you only want to answer one, that's fine. My question is first on the list of questions that you sort of raised that are out for in the world. You introduced climate and energy and the environment last. And I wondered how much, if you could say a few words about how you think those issues are related to the first ones on the list. Not only in your mind, but also in the international discussions that you're involved in. And the second question is a much more focused question, and that is what are your thoughts on if the UN and other international organizations are sort of up to the task of addressing climate change?
Sure. I'd like to say that in the Old Testament in Ezekiel is the lesson of the dry bones. So everything is connected in the dry bones. And to some extent, I said be wary of superconnection, but be conscious of the fact of clustered connection. And so my own view is, of course, I think destabilization that could come through climate change. One can only look at the agricultural world, where I don't think we have yet a big clue. Some places are going to do better and some places are going to do worse. The pessimists cleave to the latter, the optimists to the former, but we will have shifts. And they have to do with feeding, and they have to do in many parts of the world with the potential for the accentuation of poverty and failing states, and you can see that nexus, I think, without a lot of illustration. Are the international institutions capable of dealing with this? In part, yes, and certainly in large part, no. We found with the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, we had to go back to Basel and where the bankers meet, the international bankers, and talk about new ways of organizing finance. Day before yesterday, we decided the Volcker rule was a good thing. So at both ends of that spectrum, there are certainly things that need to be done. Not all international, but we hope the Volcker rule, in fact, has, in my view, international sweep because it begins to bring forward what I would call a sense of a combination of dignity, respect, and I would have to put basic honesty in the banking world, all of which we have to trust, and much of which is trusted because the international institutions, as well as the domestic institutions, have up until recently done a pretty good job in assuring that the banks will be there and operate in the broadest possible interest. We need to constantly use those institutions as one of many measures to deal with it. I would say at the other end of the spectrum, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the centerpiece of the inspection system in the recent agreement that was made with Iran, is a very important player now. They have to tell us whether, in fact, the other side is complying with the arrangements it's agreed to. And so that's significant and important.
Very nice. One more question from the audience. Ian.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for those comments. Earlier in your comments, you said that problems are often solved by bringing a package of issues to the table. From my own analysis and that of many others, I think the issue of mitigation of climate change is really only going to be solved when US and China come together. It's a C2 problem. What package do you think might help bring about that solution?
It's a great question. And I didn't say all issues are solved by packages. And in fact, I would have said that there are always three ways to deal with an intractable problem. Increase the field of endeavor, decrease the field of endeavor, or find new innovative ways of describing what the package around the present field is going to be. But I would say that the broad field of endeavor with China is, I think, in many ways, a way to get over the present issue that the Chinese position is you developed by putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere while we were trying, in fact, to move from fire to what? Electricity. Now you got yours, we want ours. And we don't want the path to be a whole hell of a lot harder. On the other hand, China probably has put more money in some renewables than many other people. So here's the beginning of a package. Can we, in some ways, provide technology? Can we assist in funding? Can we support a broader way of moving? What would be the role in that of gas, nuclear, coal, and how over a period of time in a longer basis can we plan? The notion that we on our side have to have instant major Chinese contributions to the solution to the problem is highly desirable but very unlikely. And the notion on the China side that they can continue, in effect, carbonizing the world at their whim with no regulation is not on. And we see the beginnings of some of that. So the challenge is, can we put together a kind of package where one side has an objective, but it has a robust, progressive series of steps to get there, where the other side continues to advance the technology and its own commitment to change, so that neither is riding on the back of the other, even if, in fact, there's an asymmetry in the way the packages are made. That's very easy to say. We haven't had any success, although now I think what happened in Warsaw has clearly shown that we're still not at Kyoto, but we are not yet anywhere near millennium. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's such an honor to have you here. This room is solving the intractable or seemingly intractable problem of climate risk and disruption, and the fact that you've solved so many seemingly intractable problems throughout your career and giving us this grand perspective is incredibly helpful. We appreciate it. Quite an inspiration. So now, for all of you, and especially also for our webcast, livecast audience, we're moving into the ND Gain press event. We are going to be launching the 2013 ND Gain Index and conferring our ND Gain Corporate Adaptation Prize Awards. May I invite our guests to the podium, please? Yeah, to the front. Joel and Jesus, and your partners. So let's see. And go ahead and have a seat, gentlemen. Jesus is here, and then Joel, you'll be here, and then the partners will follow. Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry. We need a few more chairs up here. Chairs, yeah. I'm sorry. Chairs? Sure, thank you. We have it here. All right, well, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the University of Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index Awards Ceremony and Press Event. We're going to start with conferring the 2 ND Gain Corporate Adaptation Prizes. The ND Gain Corporate Adaptation Prize is an annual award to acknowledge contributions to awareness, science, or action in creating resilience to climate change. By conferring this award, we aim to further our mission to enhance the world's understanding of the importance of adaptation and to facilitate public and private investment in vulnerable communities by featuring cases of best practice. This year, we sought exemplary multinational corporations who are working with local partners to decrease climate-related vulnerability. The winning corporate projects had to have measurable impact in a country ranked below 60 on the ND Gain Index and be focused on such areas as food security, water excess, coastal protection, ecosystem services, human habitats, human health, or other climate-related vulnerability. After putting out a call for applications and reviewing scores of options, ND Gain shared our findings with the ND Gain Advisory Board. You met Ken earlier this morning, and you'll meet others of them throughout the afternoon. And of course, Juan Jose was part of our convening yesterday. That board agreed upon 2 corporate adaptation leaders. On behalf of the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index and our advisory board, I'm pleased to announce that PepsiCo and Monsanto are the 2013 winners of our ND Gain Corporate Adaptation Prize. PepsiCo was recognized for their overall approach to precision agriculture in India, working with the Columbia Water Center of the Earth Institute at Columbia University and supported by a grant from the PepsiCo Foundation. India is ranked 123 out of 177 countries on the ND Gain Index and has both a high vulnerability to climate impacts and a low readiness to adapt. Especially given that ND Gain data show decreasing access to water in the country, we commend PepsiCo for their 20% water efficiency that farmers using precision farming techniques are achieving. To receive the ND Gain cap on behalf of the PepsiCo, please join me in congratulating Joel Leftwich, PepsiCo Government Affairs. Pause here just for a quick photo op.
Thank you. On behalf of PepsiCo, and in particular, our incredible team of agriculture experts, we're honored to accept this award. With brands like Pepsi, Tropicana, Quaker, Gatorade, Frito-Lay, and Walker's, just to name a few, agriculture is critical not only to our business, but also to the communities where we operate. The GAIN Index helps companies like PepsiCo identify and prioritize our work to make the best impact on key global climate challenges while continuing to support our business and operations. We have a comprehensive range of precision agriculture projects around the world that deliver more crop per drop. In India, for example, with our key partner, the Columbia Water Center, as mentioned, and supported by a grant from the PepsiCo Foundation, we have developed and deployed low-cost tensiometers to rice farmers, allowing them to conserve water in excess of 20% versus flood irrigation. We have also expanded direct seeding of rice, a program that we have delivered in approximately 10,000 hectares, conserving more than 9 billion liters of water. Direct seeding also reduces methane created by the traditional flooding irrigation techniques, resulting in 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. All of this while maintaining yield and quality paddy production. Another great example of our sustainable agriculture work is our iCrop technology. Developed by our UK team, including Mark Pettigrew, David Wilkinson, and Adam Griffiths, and in participation with Cambridge University, this precision farming technology helps farmers adapt to precipitation and temperature changes by delivering just the right amounts of water and fertilizers at just the right times. iCrop, tensiometers, drip irrigation, and other programs are part of PepsiCo's Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is driven by our company's Performance with Purpose mission. We are taking lessons learned from these projects and applying them to a continuously broader landscape, therefore expanding our impact. Thank you again for today, and thank you for this recognition.
Thank you so much, Joel. Monsanto was recognized for its effort to help smallholder farmers in Kenya through its water-efficient Maize for Africa project. Kenya ranks 153 out of 177 countries on the 2013 ND Gain Index. And ND Gain shows that Kenya's ability to produce its own food while beginning to stabilize continues to be a significant vulnerability. As precipitation there is projected to decrease in a changing climate, innovations that increase drought tolerance will help to feed the country and the world. The African Agricultural Technology Foundation is a partner in the effort, and it is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, USAID, and CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. To receive the prize on behalf of Monsanto, please join me in congratulating Jesus Madrazo, VP of Social and Public Affairs at Monsanto, who is joined by his partners. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Good morning. I'll, in the interest of time, and since I've lost my voice this morning and haven't found it back, I'll be very brief. First, on behalf of Monsanto and our partners in the Water Efficient Maize for Africa project, WIMA, we're very honored, and we would like to thank ND for this important recognition. Creating awareness, developing science, and taking action in creating resilience climate to change is so important for this partnership, and I'm so glad that it's being recognized today. With me today, we have a few of the WIMA partners. I'd like to introduce you to Stephen Mungo from CIMMYT. I'd like to introduce you to Matt Mordy from USAID. And today with us also is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation representative, our dear friend Rose Barburo. There are many other partners that could not join today, but they're important, and they're doing some phenomenal work in driving more sustainable agriculture in Africa. The African Agriculture Technology Foundation, led by Executive Director Dennis Kaiteri, they've been pioneers in enabling access of agricultural innovation in the WIMA partner countries. Another partner that was already mentioned is Howard G. Buffett Foundation. Howard is just such a strong advocate for agriculture globally, and his relentless, optimal approach in helping improve lives has been instrumental in this project. We also have 5 national agricultural research centers that are part of our partnership. And since this specifically calls out the work that we've been doing in Kenya, I'd like to recognize KARI, the Kenyan Government Agricultural Research Arm. They have been instrumental in lending their staff facilities to help us improve maize varieties in Kenya. Finally, I'd just like to share my excitement. We've just deployed the first 10 maize varieties to small farmers in Kenya this year. We are very excited and very anxious to see the yields in February. So take note, in February. As you think about 2014, think about 22,000 farmer families that will be benefited in the WEMA countries as just the starting point for this project. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks and congratulations again to our winners. We're going to have a slight transition now. Natasha and Jessica, if you want to come on stage this way, and our partners can be excused to the audience, and the questions for our partners, our winners, I'm sorry, can be saved until the end of our press event. Thank you so much. Take care. And now I'd like to welcome my colleagues, Dr. Jessica Hellman, Research Lead for the ND Global Adaptation Index, and Dr. Nitesh Chawla, Index Lead for the ND Global Adaptation Index. They will be unveiling the new ND Gain analysis that sheds light on the challenges and opportunities ahead. Dr. Hellman.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you everyone for being here, joining us today. As Joyce said, I am Professor Jessica Hellman, Director of Notre Dame's Climate Adaptation Program, and I'm here to talk about an exciting day for ND Gain. not just because we are releasing the annual index, which you can now find on our website, but because we've dug deeper into the index this year and are highlighting some data that have very important policy implications and that illustrate the enormous climate challenge that confronts us today. So ND GAIN data show that many countries are becoming more resilient to climate change by building the capacity to deal with climate stresses, things like access to clean water, enhancements in the ability to grow food, and access to electricity. But many of these advances are happening much more slowly than the pace of climate change itself. And the 2013 index shows that there are stark differences between different countries in their ability to adapt to a warmer world. But the biggest news that we found in the latest index data is that it will take more than 100 years for the poorest countries of the world just to reach the level of climate change preparedness that the developed world already enjoys. 100 years. So some example countries on that list of the 100-year trajectory are Cambodia, Kenya, and Haiti, among many others. Now, we know that there were disparities between the richest and the poorest countries when it comes to climate change adaptation and readiness to adapt to climate change, but we didn't realize that it would take more than 100 years for the poorest countries just to reach the readiness or the level of climate capacity that the richest countries have attained. And these data are sobering because they cast light on just how unprepared some of the most vulnerable nations are. But they also show that the most developed countries are also not doing enough. And they have shown gains in their preparedness recently, but those changes have also been quite slow. And this raises public policy questions, no matter how well developed your national economy may be. Now, adaptation has become a prominent topic in the last year or so, thanks to things like Sandy and the recent typhoon in the Philippines. In fact, the typhoon in the Philippines shows better than probably any recent event that critical capacities at the country level to deal with climate extremes can in fact save lives. These are exactly the kinds of capacities that we need to enhance over time and that the ND GAIN measures. But while this concept of adaptation has increased in visibility, the world still is coming to grips with the fact that we need to adapt to a changing climate, whether that means you need to move further from the coast or protect essential ecosystems in new ways, or even just finding ways to keep cool. Many dollars, billions of dollars have been pledged by the UN-led climate talks to help people adapt, but additional investments are necessary, most likely from the private sector, to fill that gap, to help turn things around, to help accelerate this 100-year horizon, to make sure that it's not 100 years, but some time period much shorter, to accelerate the rate at which countries around the world prepare for climate change. For both government investment and for corporate investment, ND GAIN is an important tool that decision makers can use to direct adaptation efforts so that those investments can do the most good and enable the greatest opportunity. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Nitesh Chavla.
Good morning. An absolute delight and pleasure to have you all with us here today. I'm Nitesh Chavla, Professor of Computer Science, lead of the Index of ND GAIN, and Director of Notre Dame Center on Network Science. And I will be the final speaker here for this session today morning, and after which we will entertain your questions. So the theme of my work is data science. I work on big data problems, and what drives the work is how can we leverage data for the common good? How can we leverage data for decision making that makes the difference to the society? And I have a history and an immense joy of collaborating with climate scientists like Jessica and David Lodge at the university, as well as other colleagues in government, NGOs, and the private sector. So as Jessica said, we took a deep dive into the index this year, a big dive into the big data, if you will. And what we found is that at current adaptation rates, it will take 100 years for the poorest countries to reach the point of climate adaptation capacity that the developed world has already attained. She mentioned examples of, Jessica mentioned examples of countries on the 100-year trajectory include Cambodia, Kenya, and Haiti. But given the recent typhoon in the Philippines, we may wonder where that island nation falls in terms of readiness. According to the data, the Philippines are about 40 years behind the most developed countries in being prepared for climate-related stresses. While that's better than the poorest countries, it still shows that Philippines has a long way to go. And this situation tells us a lot about global priorities, but from a data standpoint, this year's announcement reminds us that in addition to providing ranks of countries, which are absolute from some perspective, it's an absolute ranking, there is power in deeper insights. There's power in the relative positioning of countries, in benchmarking of countries on where the priorities may be, and those answers do lie in the data, which can then be an asset to the decision makers, be it in the private sector, the government, and the NGO community. And in leveraging the tool and data, and mind that all the tool and the software and the data is open source, so it's completely transparent, we can discern that the adaptive capacity of a country is important because it can help guide where and how the investments may have the biggest impact. We can then start to build data-driven scenarios, ask questions on how to guide those investments, what would lead to better readiness. And then we can start to identify where the relative counterparts of a country may be and how they are trending, or how those counterparts trended in the past, and where those benchmarking may happen. And we have an opportunity now in our hands to guide dialogue, which is important, and investment, which is more important, motivate citizens, and help fix the problem. We can hopefully reduce the 100-year lag in adaptive capacity between the poorest countries and developed world. Wouldn't it be great to come next year and say now it's 80 years? And the ND Gain Index is a valuable tool for decision makers to help direct their investments for the common good, reduce the vulnerability, and make the world more ready. And we are excited to collaborate in the spirit of science serving society. Thank you for your interest in the index and this year's results. It is a pleasure to be here with you. The ND Gain Index, as Jessica announced, the 2013 is live on the website. And now Jessica, Joyce, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. So questions?
Can we put in the website the top 10, the bottom 10?
Can you do that?
I think it would be nice to see that.
Yes, there's another question as we get loaded up here.
Can you tell us which countries moved up or moved down most dramatically over the past year?
Nitesh, do you want to take that one?
Well, here, you want to pull it up?
You can speak from there.
Oh, go ahead if you have the data. So what we could basically, some of the insights that we could give. So in the last 16 years, some of the best performing countries were Georgia, Croatia, Lithuania, and Rwanda. The worst performing were Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Zimbabwe. And the top countries have been Denmark, Switzerland, Australia, Norway, and United Kingdom. And many developing countries were making the fast, and the most improvements have been Rwanda, Cape Verde, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Colombia, Peru, Egypt, and Poland. And as we get more data, that's why we wanted to load up the 2013 indexes. As we release an index every year, we also start to get more data for historic years, so which adjust the ranking from that perspective and the trends from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what did you say you wanted to look at the matrix?
I think part of the answer that was given shows what I wanted to see in the screen. We are looking now at perhaps the top 11 or so, 10 countries. And if we go down, I think to answer part of the question, we can see the bottom 10. And I think it's also important to see the trend. That's the next to the last column that shows what the trend for each country is. In red, those that are not doing that well going forward. In green, the ones that seem to be doing much better. And the ones that have an equal sign means that things remain about the same as last year. But anyway, I think illustrating that will be helpful.
Yes, question, the woman with the microphone. That would be the obvious one, right?
You both talked about how it would take 100 years for the poorest countries to catch up in readiness with the most developed countries. In context with your index, what would it take, or what would have the most impact on the readiness score for these poorest countries?
So our analysis focuses on a component of the index called adaptive capacity. So these are the ingredients, the stuff that you use to deal with climate stress. So those are to the degree that a country reduces its vulnerability, it can do that in two ways. One is by enhancing these adaptive capacity dimensions. Another would be to reduce its sensitivity, which is another dimension of the index. So this 100-year measure refers to changes in that adaptive capacity. Another aspect of the index is readiness, but this 100-year number refers to that. So what are those kinds of things? A country, and what's very powerful about ND gain is that a country can go and look at all of the dimensions of adaptive capacity. So where it's lagging relative to its neighbors or relative to countries that might be peers or aspirational situations, and then focus actions on those individual dimensions. And we can pull those kind of ingredients of adaptive capacity up as well on the website, or you can go see them. If you choose an individual country, you can see all the data for the different sectors and by different components. And adaptive capacity is a key component of the index. So this is exactly what adaptation is. It's building these kinds of infrastructures and other aspects of a country that are deployed to deal with stresses.
Go ahead.
I think that the ND gain in the presentation both has some powerful numbers underneath it, and the presentation is beautiful, which I think is very important too. And it lets you see things that then ask questions about, bulletized statements of a 100-year catch-up. A question that I see that jumps directly out to me is DR Congo. I have little affinity for the place. I go there once in a while, and I can say that the downward trend is obvious that shows there. Its place in the adaptation index is clear from the level of infrastructure. It's not catching up in 100 years, not on current trajectory. It's actually in that red quadrant, and its trend is negative. So it's 100 years today, and next year it's going to be 120 years.
That's right. So the way that we performed this analysis was to look at countries by income group to give an overall picture of the sort of global situation. Individual countries will have their own trajectories, right? And they are partially reflected by this trend indication, though those are the recent changes. Our analysis is over the full time series of ND gain, which goes all the way back to 1995. So individual countries will have their own trajectory. And it's also important, remember, that developed countries also have trends, and those trends are not increasing in adaptive capacity particularly quickly either. So it's not to say that the developed world is the best example of adaptive capacity. As we've seen lots of effects, for example, recently with Sandy in the United States, it suggests we need gains there as well. But our emphasis is we want to show how the power of long-term data and having a time series of data that's accumulated over time can give insights into how the situation is changing and put a challenge up there for us to try to achieve.
And that's what it ties down to, is how financial resources and financial investments and resources can then be mobilized, which may help accelerate the reduction, not accelerate the lag.
Other questions?
Oh, you have one right here, Joy. Oh, okay.
So,
Nancy, go ahead.
Thank you, Joyce. I wanted to ask, our organization frequently works in facilitating conversations between the private sector and at a national scale. And we heard earlier this morning the power that private sector can come in. Oil and gas was the example of actually bringing in, and through license to operate discussions, create some large-scale change. So how would you advise that we could use ND Gain if a private sector player wants to understand, or even at a national scale, the country wants to understand, in those license to operate negotiations, what should they be asking for to actually go ahead and increase their ability to respond to climate change?
So I think that's an excellent question. I think there are three things that ND Gain helps to inform in that kind of description. The first is to take the set of countries that you're discussing and compare them to one another in terms of their gain score. In doing so, you can often find those countries that are the most vulnerable, but also the most ready, which are prime for investment, because vulnerability, if it's known, is an opportunity. It's the unknown risk that's the hardest risk for the private sector. So you have the class of countries that are in the highly vulnerable, but also more ready quadrant. Then you have those countries in your set that are perhaps highly vulnerable and not ready at all. So they're much further out on the spectrum. The Democratic Republic of Congo would be a perfect example of that. Those are countries that likely, if you're talking from the corporate perspective, you may not have huge holdings in unless you're in the extractives industry or another industry that needs to be working in areas with high wealth and natural resources, but low wealth regarding other readiness measures. So that's the first thing to do, is to take their scores and understand them from the perspective of readiness and vulnerability. The second thing would be to look specifically at various measures of vulnerability for each of these countries, be it their water vulnerability as it relates to their water access, their sanitation access, their miles of pipeline for agricultural and potable water, or perhaps it's their human health indicators, or it's their coastal infrastructure or energy infrastructure or transportation infrastructure indicators, and really determine through the index where there are the biggest opportunities in those countries that are both highly vulnerable and more ready for your company to either invest in as a capital investment or use as part of your supply chain, or perhaps even consider in terms of your merger and acquisition. So that would be the second thing. And then the third thing would be to look very carefully at the governance measures within the index, which are part of our readiness set, the readiness set being economic, governance, and social indicators, and really determine where amongst those various sectors you've just determined from vulnerability, you have the opportunity to work with a government that's highly transparent, has a fair rule of law, has a taxation structure that you can stomach, and so on. And I think the question that you started with was this, we've talked about the public and the private. The opportunity is for the private sector to not only make these investments as part of their return on investment, because there is an incredible amount of money to be made in these markets in a way that actually contributes to solving this humanitarian crisis of climate change, but also perhaps to ask the question about where we sit as it relates to partnerships with the government. Because there is also money, and there will be a growing pot of money, according to the various COPs and the Green Climate Fund, for investments in those highly vulnerable and not ready countries.
And if I may add, Joyce.
Please.
So one important aspect of the release in 2014 is from a private sector decision-making perspective, is conducting those scenarios that what if an investment were to be made for water, what would that mean? And creating the scenarios live on the website by interacting with the data, because we can know where the vulnerability readiness is, where the low points are, where the high points are across the different dimensions, and what if a needle were to be moved in a certain way? What would that mean? So hopefully we can create those kinds of scenarios and see what the value add of the investment or some initiative could be.
Yeah, it jumped out at me when you scroll through the entire list that the countries that are listed on the bottom of the list, where you would by default kind of assume that there's no way to go but up, about half the countries there had a red arrow pointing downwards. I probably would expect to see the same thing on the readiness piece. And question I had is, are you seeing some common threads between these countries that are actually trending in the wrong direction to the previous question that was asked, even though they're at the bottom of the rung? And are you seeing some inspiring stories on countries that actually made huge moves in the positive direction that are in the bottom of the list? And can you share some of these? And to the private sector question, can activities, for example, in the DRC, the whole SEC regulation regarding conflict minerals, something that will that can alleviate where the private sector might actually be adding to the instability in that region, it can make it better. Will those things in terms of governance actually help improve some of these readiness dimensions?
That's an excellent question. So I will just say around those trends that I also find it quite striking that there are in fact several countries in the lower quadrant, not just the lower 10, but the lower 50 or so, that in fact have seen a positive trend year on year over the last 6 years. So the trends in the ND Gain Index are measured over the course of 6 years. The past 3 years plus the 3 years prior to that. And part of the reason for that is that, as you can imagine, to get apples to apples data for each of these countries from 1995 through to 2012, which is what the index currently contains, you're looking at a little bit of a data lag. So that's why we make sure that our trends aren't simply year on year, but actually include 6 years. And one of the major reasons why you're seeing an uptick in the green trend going up, two things. One is that, of course, it's relative. So, you know, there are countries that, even in the United States, for instance, our maternal mortality numbers are actually getting worse. And so that fact, even though we're in the OECD high-income countries, actually impacts everyone in the index because it's all relative to one another. So I think that's a really important question about why some of these other countries on the bottom actually appear to be doing better. If you were in those countries, you might not feel that improvement necessarily, but it's relative to others who may be coming down a little bit, number one. But number two, there are some really key measures in the index that many countries are seeing a bump in. And one of them does have to do with the ability to provide their own food. So agricultural innovation, some of which we heard this morning with WEMA, the Water Efficient Maize Project of Monsanto and their partners, are really good examples of increasing the ability for the food supply to be secure. So there are other measures on the readiness side, for instance, that have to do with telephony and the access to cellular infrastructure, which has really made a transformative impact across the index, and of course really contributes to resiliency. That was one of those wonderful leapfrogs of innovation that is driven by the private sector. If I could just come back to that question for a moment, that one of the very important reasons to have the private sector involved in this climate adaptation question is that what we need to do is to grow this pie, not simply think about how to get a bigger piece out of an existing pie. And the only way to do that, from my personal perspective, is to actually increase innovation in the private sector that addresses these seemingly intractable problems. So the question of cell phones and the transformation that that's had on communications around the world, and not just communications that are verbal, but also monetary transactions, has a significant impact on some of those trends as well.
Can I add one other thing also, Joyce? I think it's tempting to look at the bottom of the list and say, oh, these countries are all in dire straits and all of their recent 6-year trends are negative. But remember, the ND Gain, the score and the ranking is an entry point. The trend is further information. Then it's helpful to go look at those countries as a group, and you can actually find cases where there are bright spots. You know, so the overall trend is an average of an average of an average, and there's insight to be gained in unpacking that. So I'd love to sit down with you. We could look into these bottom countries, and we could find some highlights and some places where you could say, all right, here's a place, say, in an element of adaptive capacity where we're making progress, and we can there's hope for.
Can we go to the woman that hasn't had a question here? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, a lot of climate adaptation I know is important to examine on a local level, because so much of this in regional and in cities is so distinct in different parts. So as far as I've seen, it's on the country level. Do you have any plans to examine regional or city adaptation measures?
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of our major goals for 2014 is to find city partners, governmental partners, private sector partners, to focus on a group of cities. And we say group of cities because to find cities that are similar to each other, alike to each other, and seeing how those trends are happening. So that's absolutely our top priority for 2014.
Yeah, if you come back in a year, there will be a number of innovations that you'll see with ND Gain. And I mean, that we aspire to innovate all of the time to bring cutting edge information. There are, I mean, ND gain, you need to think about the country context in every case. Smaller countries versus larger countries, diverse countries versus countries that are fairly uniform across them. So I think the country level information has a lot of insight, but again, it's a starting point. And we look forward to being able to provide higher resolution. I think that's a trend in a lot of indicators going
what
forward.
we'd love to do is, because as I said, it's all open source, open data. If we can create models of doing it at country levels, at city levels, it would be great to inspire folks all over the world, where citizens go, scientists in a city in China say, I'll build one for my city. I have the model to build after. That's a beautiful way for us to scale at different city, find partners, and that's hopefully we can aspire to start to do in 2014.
Other questions?
I was just curious if you had any examples of countries using the tool for their low emission development strategies.
For their low emission development strategies. So yeah, the question was if there are any examples of the country using its tool. So we have an example of the country of Mozambique, for instance, using the tool to better understand its food security. I think from the perspective of emissions, I think we should be clear here that we're not talking about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions as it relates to ND gain, although of course mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is a huge part of the exposure portion of the ND gain index. In order to decrease exposure around the world, we need to increase mitigation. Adaptation from the perspective of ND gain really has to do with increasing resiliency around coastal infrastructure, water access, human health, ecosystem services, and so on.
So of the underlying bits of the index, if you were to say meet all of the Millennium Development Challenge goals, what wouldn't change? What would be the leftover dial that is ND gain, global adaptation specific, that might not be met by other goals?
That's an excellent question. Well, I think one thing to acknowledge about the Millennium Development Goals is that they don't go directly into some of these questions of hard infrastructure, which are really at the heart of both the vulnerability and the readiness part of the index. So coastal infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and transportation infrastructure are not specifically called out in the Millennium Development Goals. On the other hand, gain is quite complementary to MDC, especially given that we have a significant emphasis on human health, habitats, and water, which obviously, and food, which are really quite up there on the MDCs.
Yeah, I would add that a lot of these components of adaptive capacity are associated with development. But to think about climate, so you might ask, so should we adapt to the climate by just fostering economic development? And the answer to that is probably yes, though we also have to think about the greenhouse gas emissions and the exposure component. But to achieve adaptation, you also would want that directed to risks posed specifically by climate change. And ND gain would point you to many of those climate-specific risks.
We have time for one more question. In the back there in the red. Sarah?
Hi, yes. Thank you for this presentation. I've noticed that out of the top 13 countries, 6 of them have a red down arrow. And it's a small negative trend, but it is a trend. I was curious, is that insignificant or is that significant, particularly in the sense of these lead nations' roles as role models for other countries and as funders for global adaptation strategies?
So I'm really glad you asked that, because when we talk about the fact that the lower income countries will not catch up to the OECD high income countries for 100 years, we want to be very clear that the high income countries are not at a place of complete resiliency. So it's attaining a goal that is marginal at best in terms of being adaptive to the changes that climate disruption brings. But I do also want to acknowledge that these downward arrows are an aggregation of 50 indicators that go into each one of the country gain scores. And so when you're looking at this downward arrow, I mean, it's possible, I unfortunately don't know all the story of Denmark, but it's possible that there, some of the economic changes in the European Union, for instance, have had that impact. And the wonderful thing about gain is that you could double click on Denmark and go into the country profile and find that out very readily. There'll be an indicator for within the index in each country profile for those 3 indicators that are doing the poorest, and those are the ones that are contributing to this downward trend. So.
Yeah, it may be a little data wonky, but you can, this is, for example, on this page gives the overall score and gives you that little triangle. Then you can click on vulnerability and you can see the triangle specific to vulnerability for that country, and you can click on readiness and see it. And then if you click on the country profile, you'll see it for each of the individual indicators. There are interesting things when you look at the trends of the most developed countries at those adaptive capacities. We mentioned that they're also increasing at a slow rate. There's some evidence to suggest that they actually may be increasing at a slower rate than some developing countries. So the developed world also needs to be thinking long and hard about reinforcing the key things that we need in order to withstand climatic changes.
And some of the ongoing financial crisis has had an impact on the wealthier nations as well. So that trend is also evident in what we see in the last, because the trends calculated over the last 6 years.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming. This concludes the ND GAIN 2013 Index release, and I'd like to welcome all of you for some refreshments outside in the boardroom just adjacent to the 6th floor. And in about 20 minutes, we'll be convening the next panels, the last panels of the 2013 annual meeting. We'll have a supply chain in the face of a changing climate panel here in the auditorium, and then the Money for Resiliency panel downstairs beneath us directly on the 5th floor. So thank you so much.